So just to give a little background about where we're up to in the overall story of the Torah. So we're toward the end of the fourth book. This is the third to last portion of the fourth book. Next week we're going to read two portions. So next week it's two portions combined. So next week we're going to actually conclude the fourth book. So I know there's another whole book of the Torah, and we don't finish the Torah until the high holidays. But in reality, the story of the Torah is sort of nearing its conclusion because, as you know, the fifth book is the book of Deuteronomy, which is the book of the repetition, where Moshe repeats many of the stories that happened in the past 40 years, and he repeats some of the laws. But there really isn't any, there's not really any new episodes taking place in all of the fifth book. The fifth book is just the last 37 days of Moses' life, is recounting and retelling the history of the last 40 years. So when we read this parsha, we have to think about the parsha in context as sort of the end of the journey of the Torah. The people are already camped at the Jordan River, opposite Jericho, pretty much ready to cross. I mean, they're not going to cross for another few weeks, really, and probably a few weeks, I would say. It was really a few months, really, it's 2 months. But the history, in other words, the stories, the episodes are sort of concluded. We are at where we need to be. The next step is to cross the Jordan. And therefore, if you look at this parsha, you will see indeed that most of the stories and most of the episodes in the parsha are related to the fact that it's the end of the 40 years, the end of Moses' life. We're about to cross over in the Jordan River. You have stories like a census, the final census which Moshe takes, which again, the Medrash says, Moshe is like a shepherd. He shepherded the people for 40 years. If you hire a shepherd, so they take a census. When you count your sheep, when you give the sheep to the shepherd, and then when the shepherd gives back the sheep to the owner, you also have to count the sheep to make sure everybody is being returned. So the Medrash says, similarly, you have a census in the beginning of the 40 years, in the beginning of Moshe's leadership, but then you also have a census at the end of Moshe's leadership, and Moshe's, quote unquote, so to speak, giving back the sheep to God. You also have other stories where we're talking about the division of the land of Israel, how to divide the land of Israel. We have other stories about inheritance, daughters of Tzalafchad. There was this man who died without any sons. The daughters say, we want our father's inheritance. Up to that point, the woman would not inherit. And in fact, God creates a new commandment, so to speak, and says that the woman, if there are no sons, the woman, the girl, the daughter would inherit. And again, these are stories that only arise because we're about to cross over into the land of Israel. And then, of course, you have the story of Moshe asking God, please appoint a successor for me so that the people will have a leader after he passes away. So all I'm saying is that when we read the Parsha, we have to think about the fact that it's not really at the end of, it's not really sort of the middle of the Torah. We're not that far from the conclusion of the Torah. Because like I said, the fourth book is going to conclude, and then then it's over. The fifth book is just repetition. So with that introduction, we'll share the screen, God willing, and read the portion in a nutshell, and then we'll start to read the specifics. Of course, this opening story and the name of the parsha, Pinchas, is related to an event that happened in last week's parsha, which we did not discuss. And it's a very troubling story. So we'll read the nutshell, and then maybe we'll get into that story. I don't want to spend all the time on this story because it's a troubling story and the question, but hopefully we can learn a lesson from that as well. So here we go. The journey begins. It's like you say about war. You know how it starts, and you don't know how it's going to finish. That's what I feel like. We know where we're starting. We don't know where we're going to end up. But here we go. The journey begins. So Pinchas in a nutshell. Aaron's grandson Pinchas is rewarded for his act of zealotry in killing the Simonite prince Zimri and the Midianite princess who was his paramour. God grants him a covenant of peace and a priesthood. So we'll discuss that. A census of the people's count, 601,730 men between the ages of 20 and 60. We don't count Jews, we don't count people. The counting is specifically for battle, and therefore they only count men who are in the age of ready to go to battle, which is 20 to 60. Moses is instructed on how the land is to be divided by lottery among the tribes and families of Israel. The 5 daughters of Tzalafchad petitioned Moses that they be granted the portion of the land belonging to their father, who died without sons. God accepts their claim and incorporates it into the Torah's laws of inheritance. Moses empowers Joshua to succeed him and lead the people into the land of Israel. And finally, we have the final paragraph of this nutshell, but in the Torah, it's a nice section. It's probably almost a third of the parsha, about offerings, which is a big problem because we're not in the third book. We're not in the book of Leviticus. We're not in the book that's focused on offerings. So what are the offerings doing here? That's a good question. We'll have to address that, God willing. The parsha concludes with a detailed list of daily offerings and the additional offerings brought on Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, which is the first of the month, and the festivals of Passover, Shavuot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and Shmini Atzeret. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the portion of the portion in a nutshell. To really understand what happened with Pinchas, I think we have to go back, and we have to read the end of last week's parsha, and then we'll go to the beginning of this week's parsha, and we will hopefully see what's going on here. Okay, but before we do that, we want to talk about what was last week's parsha. We're going backward. Last week's parsha was the following. The Jewish people are camped opposite the Jordan River. They have a nation, Moab, to their south, and Moab is afraid of the Jewish people. They can't attack them militarily because they realize that the Jewish people are mighty because they conquered the lands of the 2 superpowers of the east of the Jordan, Sichon and Og. So they're looking to attack the Jewish people by other means. So they investigate and say, what is the power of the Jewish people? What's the power of their leader, Moshe? They say, oh, Moshe is a prophet. So they say, okay, Moshe is a prophet. He's got spiritual power. We have to counter. If we're going to attack them, we have to attack him with a spiritual tool. So they reach out to the Gentile prophet Bilam, and Bilam goes and they hire Bilam to curse the Jews. And there's the whole story. Long story short, Bilam ends up blessing the Jews instead of cursing the Jews because God interferes and ensures that the Gentile prophet, blessed the Jews instead of cursing the Jews. Okay, that's fine. He's about to go home. Bilam, failed mission. He was hired to bless the Jews. He's hired to curse the Jews. Instead, he blesses the Jews. So the verse doesn't say so explicitly, but the rabbis deduce this from an earlier verse, which I'll try to show you. And what happens is they say that Bilam, the Gentile prophet, tells Balak, the king of Moab, he says, if you really want to overpower the Jews, there's only one way. God hates immorality. And therefore, if you want to overpower the Jews, you have to get them to sin. And that's exactly what happens. The daughters of Moab seduced the Jews, first of all, for intimate relations, but also for idol worship, as you will see. And then there's this great plague. And when this plague happens, Moshe tells the Jewish people, you have to go and you have to kill the sinners. Then there's the leader of the tribe of Shimon, who most of his tribe were the tribe who sinned. And he takes a Midianite woman and he comes before Moshe and he says, I'm allowed to marry her. And if you protest, then I will question your marriage to your wife, because Moshe also married a Midianite woman. Now, it happens to be that Moshe's wife, Zipporah, of course, converted, but that's another story. and Moshe doesn't know what to do. Pinchas, long story short, Pinchas does an act of violence. We're going to refer to it as zealotry, which kina in jealousy in biblical Hebrew, that could be positive or negative. We'll discuss that. And he kills the leader of the tribe of Shimon and the Midianite princess. Now, last week's parsha ended, and we got this indication that it probably is positive. It was a positive act, even though it was an act of violence, because as soon as he did that, the plague amongst the Jews stopped. This week we continue and we read about the sort of the blessing which Pinchas gets for this act of zealotry, of violence, which is a strange story because you would expect. I mean, the story makes us uncomfortable because why is violence the answer? But hopefully we'll try to address that. Hopefully, I don't know if we'll do so satisfactory, but we'll try. So here we go. So this is last week's portion. Israel settled in Shittim, and the people began to commit harlotry with the daughters of Moab. Now, why did the rabbis say that this was by advice of Bilam? Because if you scroll back, the final series of Bilam's words, the verse says, now I'm going to my people, come, I will advise you what this people will do to your people at the end of days. I will advise you. Now, what he was about to say about the prophecy of the end of days is not advice. It's just telling you what's going to happen. What is the advice? Doesn't say. So the rabbis say, you know what the advice was? The advice was what's going to unfold with the story of the daughters of Moab. And that's what happens. He advises them to send their daughters to seduce the Jewish men. And that's exactly what happened. They invited the people to sacrifice to their gods, and the people ate and prostrated themselves to their gods. So there are really two sins. Two sins. There's harlotry, and then there is the idol worship. Israel became attached to Baal Peor. Baal Peor was the idol of the Moabites. And the anger of the Lord flared against Israel. The Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and hang them before the Lord, facing the sun, and then the flaring anger of the Lord will be removed from Israel. Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you shall kill the men who became attached to Baal Peor. It's a capital crime, idol worship. Then an Israelite man came and brought the Midianite woman to his brethren before the eyes of Moses and before the eyes of the entire congregation of the children of Israel, while they were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Why were they weeping? Rashi says nobody knows what to do because, let's open the Rashi here, show Rashi's commentary. Let's show the Rashi's commentary here. Let's see if we can find it. In front of the eyes of Moses, they said to him, Moses, is this one forbidden or is she permitted? If you say it is forbidden, who permitted you, the daughters of Jethro? As it is stated there in the Talmud. In other words, Moshe, she says, if you say we cannot have relations with this woman, how could you marry your wife, which was a Midianite? So everyone's crying, nobody knows what to do. This is an attack on Moses himself. Verse 7, Pinchas, the son of Elazar, the son of Aaron, the Kohen, saw this, arose from the congregation and took a spear in his hand. He went after the Israelite man into the chamber and drove it through both of them, the Israelite man and the woman through her stomach, and the plague ceased from the children of Israel. And those that died in the plague numbered 24,000. So there's a terrible plague that breaks out as a result of the sin. Pinchas kills the leader of the tribe of Shimon and the Midianite woman, and the plague stops. Now we go to this week's parsha. This week's parsha is the continuation of that story.
How do they know it's from the tribe of Shimon?
The verse is going to say it in this week's parsha. Pinchas, this week's parsha, the Torah gives you exactly who it was. Here it goes. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, Pinchas, son of Elazar, the son of Aaron the Kohen, has turned my anger away from the children of Israel by his zealousy, avenging me among them, so that I did not destroy the children of Israel because of my zeal. Therefore say, I hereby give him my covenant of peace. This is totally strange. But nevertheless, it shall be for him and his descendants after him as an eternal covenant of kehuna, of priesthood, because he was zealous for his God and atoned for the children of Israel. The name of the Israelite man who was killed, who was slain with the Midianite woman, was Zimri, son of Salu, the chieftain of the Simonite paternal house. He was the chief of the tribe of Shimon. And the name of the Midianite woman who was slain was Cosbi, the daughter of Tsur, a national leader of the paternal house of Midian. And that is the opening name of this parsha, named Pinchas, because of this episode. We spent a lot of time on this. I want to just try to just offer a little bit of insight, and then hopefully move on to other stories. First point we want to make is a very interesting phenomenon here, just a technicality. Pinchas is the grandson of Aaron, yet he was not a priest. Only because he killed these two people does he get the priesthood in reward. Why was Pinchas not a priest? So there's a technical answer. First, there's the joke. The joke is the guy comes to the rabbi and says, I want to be a Kohen, I want to be a priest. The rabbi says, I can't help you. So the man tells the rabbi, I really want to become a priest. How about if I give you a big donation to your building campaign? So the rabbi says, okay, so tell me, why do you want to be a priest so badly? So he says, well, my father was a Kohen, my grandfather was a Kohen, I also want to be a Kohen. Of course, it's a joke, because if your father is a Kohen and your grandfather is a Kohen, then you're a Kohen. You don't have to make a donation to the building campaign. But in any case, so here, why was Pinchas not a priest? He was Pinchas, the son of Elazar, the son of Aaron the priest, so she should be a priest. The answer is because Pinchas was born before his father became a priest. When God says Aaron will be a priest, it's Aaron and his 4 sons will be sanctified. And any child born after they were sanctified, after they became priests. So what does it turn out? It turns out that Aaron and all his descendants will be priests, except for who? Except for the one grandchild who was already alive. Who was that? That was Pinchas. So Pinchas is the only guy in the family who's not a priest. Yet, at this moment, 40 years after his father became a priest, because he acted in what was seen as violence and seen as something negative, but God says it's something positive, it's an act of peace. Therefore, God says, you know what, you're getting the blessing of priesthood. So now the whole family is priests. Okay, so how do you begin to make sense of the story? I don't know, because I don't know, it's a complicated story, but I just want to say one little aspect here. The question is, let's think about Aaron and priesthood. Aaron was the priest. Why is Aaron the priest? Aaron is the priest because Aaron is a man of love. In the Jewish literature, Aaron is a symbol of peace. The ethics of the fathers say, be of the students of Aaron, a lover of peace, of the pursuer of peace. Aaron is a man of peace. Is it always good to be a man of peace? Is it a problem to be a man of peace all the time? And the answer is that usually it's very good to be a man of peace, but sometimes it's negative. When is it negative? When is it bad to be a man of peace? So if you could think back about Aaron's career and think about a time when Aaron's quote unquote peaceful demeanor got him into trouble. I don't mean got him into trouble. I mean, it harmed his position as a leader of the people. And
golden calf.
The golden calf. The people come to Aaron and they say, just 40 days after they heard, do not serve idols, and they heard, I'm the Lord your God, and they heard the second commandment, do not serve any idols, and the people say, could you please make us an idol? And what does Aaron say? Aaron, he tries to delay, but Aaron says yes. Essentially, he says yes. Not only does he say yes, he actually builds it. Why? Why doesn't he get up and say, I'm the leader, I am telling you what you're doing is wrong, and I'm going to stand up to you? What's the answer? The answer is Aaron is a man of peace. Aaron's style of leadership is not confrontational. Now, there are some advantages to that and some disadvantages to that, right? If you're a parent, sometimes one parent goes along with the children too much. The other parent sometimes the parent has too much discipline. So it's very hard to get the balance. But if a person is always going to always be agreeable, it's a wonderful quality because you can make peace between people and you can actually probably influence people in the long run more through peace, through understanding, than just through commanding the way Moshe did. But there is a danger that if you're always going to go and always going to be a man of peace, when it comes a time when you have to be strong, when it comes a time where, yes, you have to use violence and you don't know how to do it, then you're not going to be able to do the right thing. So what happens? This is not just a technicality that Pinchas was not a priest. It means that Aaron's priesthood, Aaron's family is incomplete because Aaron's quality of love and peace is good for most of the time, but sometimes you need what the Kabbalah refers to. You need to integrate the gevura, the strength, with the kindness. And that is what Pinchas does. When someone in the priestly family who are people of love, and that's exactly what God says. God says, what Pinchas did is actually not an act of violence. Of course, technically it's an act of violence, but it's motivated by love. It's motivated by peace. So you have to be careful. Sometimes, and what appears to be peace is really violent, is really negative and really violence. And other times, what appears to be an act of violence is really an act of love. When Pinchas stands up and kills the sinner in this exceptional case, it's not the normal case, but in this, when at some cases, when it's an exception to the rule, if you're not going to go and be willing to use violence to defend what you believe in, defend your family, defend your country, whatever it may be, then if you're never willing to use that strength, then you're not really peaceful, because ultimately you're going to be harming yourself and your society. So what God comes along and says, for Aaron's family to be complete, they have to be able to incorporate an act of gevura, an act of strength. And then the priesthood is complete. Then the love that is represented by Aaron is healthy. The love is healthy if occasionally you're able to have discipline and strength. If you're always giving and always loving and you never make borders and you never fight for something that you believe in, then even the love itself ultimately is not complete and is going to be harmful. Because sometimes the violence is actually a sign of love. And a simple example is you have a child doing something dangerous. So you grab the knife away from the child's hand. Okay? So is that an act of violence or is that an act of peace? Or I could say, you know what? The kid wants to do it here. Here's the knife, or here are the drugs, or whatever it may be, right? And then you say, was that giving that to them, giving the child a harmful substance, is that an act of peace or is that an act of violence, right? So it's not so simple to define. And the point here is that what the Torah is saying, although generally we're people of peace, and although generally we don't solve problems with violence, but if you're not willing to do so occasionally, then the peace is incomplete. Now, this is a difficult story. It's going to make most people uncomfortable. It will make me a little bit uncomfortable, but that is the story. I'm happy to take a question or two or three on this, but then we have to move on because there's a lot more going on in this parsha. Go ahead, Vicky.
Have a couple of questions. The first one, can we make a parallel between this and the flood? How God exercises His power in justice on the border of love in order to save humanity. So to parallel our Sunday topic. And the second question is, what was it a coincidence that Pinchas wasn't actually in a lineage to exercise the opposing characteristic of love?
Right. So Pinchas
exercise gevura. So was it a coincidence that he wasn't a priest?
You have to think about that, because I would think that Pinchas represents the ability to have that strength. So it's not naturally part of the priesthood. But God says, make no mistake, I'm giving him, the verse we read before was, Hineni noten lo et briti shalom, I'm giving Pinchas my covenant of peace. Now, there's a whole backstory. I don't want to spend too much time. There's a whole backstory. The fascinating Rashi. Rashi says, why do you have to say again, Pinchas, the son of Elazar, the son of Aaron, the priest? We already know that. First of all, we said it last parsha. Second of all, just say Pinchas, son of Elazar. We already know that Elazar is the son of Aaron. So there's a beautiful Rashi, absolutely fascinating Rashi. Rashi says like this. Pinchas had an interesting lineage. His father's father was Aaron. His mother's father was Jethro, the Midianite convert, father-in-law of Moses. So his mother was a Midianite. His grandmother, Elazar's wife, was a Midianite woman. His grandfather was Jethro. So says the Rashi as follows. Rashi quotes the Medrash. When Pinchas takes his act of violence, the Jewish people say the Shvatim, the tribes, since it's something that is so un-Jewish, uncharacteristic, violence for Jewish people, it's so uncharacteristic, the tribes, they would insult Pinchas, and they say, you see this guy Pinchas? his grandfather would fatten cows just to slaughter them for idol worship. And now he's going to go and kill the leader of Shimon. Says Medrash, that is why the Torah says he's the son of Jethro too, but he's the son of Elazar, the son of Aaron. That's the Medrash. Well, the Rebbe once explained this Medrash and says like this: What are the Jewish people saying? The Jewish people are saying fattening a cow for slaughter is an act of cruelty. The Jewish people are saying, you know why Pinchas grabbed the knife, grabbed the spear, and went and killed them? Not because he's so holy, because he's cruel. So even if, look, somebody has to do the dirty work, why are you the one? Why are you volunteering? Oh, because you're cruel. So what does God say? God says, no. The reason why he did it wasn't because of cruelty. The reason why he did it was because he was a descendant of Aaron. It was motivated by love. And that's why it says you get the blessing of peace. So this is a little tricky because the act of violence, God testifies and God says this is really an act of love. Now this
Rabbi,
is,
how is he related to Jethro?
his brother's mother. Elazar married Elazar, the priest, Aaron's son, married Jethro's daughter. The verse is a clear verse that states that. So Elazar, the high priest, was Moshe's nephew, but also Moshe's brother-in-law. I don't want to get too confusing here.
Okay.
But there's a clear verse that says Elazar, the son of Aaron, took for himself from the daughters of Putiel. Putiel is another name for Jethro. So he has both these families coming into one person. Now, the people look at him and say, you see this guy? He's the grandson of the outsider. He's the grandson of the convert. He's the grandson of the guy who's an idol worshiper. And he has the audacity to kill a Jewish leader of the tribe of Shimon. And the Rebbe explains, they're saying, you're just doing it because you're cruel. And what does God say? Pinchas, this act is really a product, the son of Elazar, the son of Aaron. This act is actually a product of his motivation. His motivation is love. So you can't always look at the act. You'll have to look at the motivation. Only God knows the motivation, by the way. That's why the people were upset at him, because they're justified in being upset. Why are you so violent? But sometimes God himself intervenes and testifies and says, this act of cruelty, quote unquote, in other words, it seems an act of cruelty, the act of violence is motivated by peace. And therefore and God rewards him. So what is the message of this? I'm not saying that the message is next time you see someone doing something wrong, you should kill him. I don't think that's the message. In fact, it's not the message. But the message is, if we think about love and we think about peace and we think about in this world, it's necessary to have gevura, to have strength, to have a little bit of sometimes you need discipline, and the discipline for parents, but in other forms as well. Sometimes the discipline, we feel guilty. I don't want to discipline. I feel guilty. I want to be peace. I want to be loving. So what the message here is, sometimes the act of discipline is actually an act of love. And if you have too much love and no discipline, it's not really loving. It's actually harmful. So that's one way to read the story. There are other ways, but
Rabbi?
Yes.
With all the people who are named and not named, Cosby is named a couple of times here. What's the significance of Cosby being named?
Cosby, the daughter of Tzur. Why do you have to name the Midianite woman? So the way the rabbis explain it is because there's going to be a war, next parsha, there's going to be a war against Midian. And the Midian was considered, that's next week's parsha in Matot. There's this terrible war against Midian. Why is the war against Midian? So this is almost like it's a war of vengeance. In other words, we're going to go and retaliate. Why are we going to retaliate against Midian? What did they do wrong? They didn't attack us physically, but they attacked us spiritually. How did they attack us spiritually? They too sent their daughters to entice the Jews to first harlotry and then adultery and then idolatry. So that's going to be later. We're going to be at that war next week. So the Torah now wants to tell you how terrible the Midianites are. So what do? To cause the people to sin, they didn't send the women that are not prominent, the women that don't have any important lineage. They actually sent the leaders of the Midianites, sent their daughters to harlotry to entice the Jews. That shows their great hate, that they would sacrifice their own daughters just for this act of causing the Jews to sin. So by highlighting that the daughter of the people that the woman was the daughter of Cosby, the son of the daughter of Tsur, who is the leader of a leader of a paternal house in Midian. In other words, he's a leader of a prominent family in Midian. That is going to highlight the hate of Midian to the Jewish people.
Thank you.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Okay, in this entire discussion, we are asking what is the message? In other words, we are assuming that there is a message. And so, well, maybe that's okay. Maybe as Jews, we decide that every event, all of history, everything that happens has a message. And that's, I have no problem with that assumption. But are we comfortable with the assumption that all of history has a message?
Okay, so I'm trying to answer that on two levels. First of all, before you get to the Hasidic answer is that yes, everything has a message. Everything I know, everything I heard of, everything I saw has a message. But that's the Hasidic answer. Before we get to the Hasidic answer, it is not actually the case that every event in that period made it into the Torah, right? The Jewish people are in the desert for 40 years, okay? I'm sure there were other events that took place, but those events did not make it into the Torah. Now, the word Torah means lesson, right? The word Torah, the etymology of the word Torah comes from the word horah, lesson. So if the understanding is that this event, if it did not have a lesson for us, it's very interesting. So go to the history book and go read it in the history book. Why do you need to write it in the Torah? The Torah is not in the history business. In other words, the question becomes, when you see the Torah, what is the purpose of the Torah? And the traditional interpretation is that the purpose of the Torah is in its name, right? The name of the Torah itself refers to itself as Sefer HaTorah Hazeh, the scroll of this Torah. What does Torah mean? Lesson. Now, why is it called lesson? You could say, well, because there are 613 commandments. Those are the lessons. But if that's the case, who needs the stories, right? The Torah is not here just to give us lullabies, or not lullabies. What are the fairy tales to tell our children before we put them to sleep? That's not what the Torah is. Torah is a lesson. That's what the word means. So the assumption is, if an event made it into the Torah, it's a lesson for eternity. If not, it's a nice story, but it didn't have to make it into the Torah, even if it happened, because I am sure there are many events that happened over those 40 years that you think there's 38 years that is silence. There's nothing, we don't hear anything about it. Believe me, if there were Jews, 600,000 Jews together, believe me, there were events, believe me, they were fighting, believe me, there was stuff happening. But that is not necessarily relevant to us, because that is not necessarily a lesson for everybody. So the short answer is that the traditional view is, because the Torah itself refers to itself as Torah, anything in the Torah is indeed part of Torah, indeed part of a lesson. So
well, Rabbi, okay, the definition of the historical period is that it's written down. And so, yes, so in the Torah, you're saying it's a subset of history. So, and maybe there are other writings in that period, certainly mercantile, merchants had to keep stock of their inventory. So they had, so presumably they had a system, which kind of was written down. And I don't know. I guess there's, I don't know, the Dead Sea Scrolls or whatever, or maybe there are examples of history per se during that period where it's not in the Torah.
Right, but again, I agree that there are historic writings of the time. But I'm saying, even if you buy a book, the first thing you need to know when you go to the library is what section. Are you in the law section? Are you in the fiction section? Are you in the nonfiction section? Are you buying a book of code? Are you buying a book of history? And you want to know what is the function of this book. And one way to find out is what the book is called. So I'm not saying there's no history in the Torah, right? What I'm saying is, how does the Torah define itself? And how does the Torah define the historical events that are in it? So there's one collective word. The collective word is Torah, and history. And really it's Torah is just a Hebrew way of saying this is a book of lessons. If this is a book of lessons, then the assumption is that everything in the book is a lesson. If whatever is not a lesson, not everything was included. That's clear. So whatever was not included is not a lesson, or it's not a lesson for everybody, or it's not a lesson for eternity. Could have been very relevant if you're traveling through the desert. Could be very relevant to know what to eat for breakfast and which plants to stay away from, and what time it's too hot and what time you should put on your sunscreen. I'm sure there were a lot of lessons for the people of that time, but that was not included in the Torah. So in other words, there are gaps in the historical record, and you see from the Torah itself that the Torah does not always stick to the chronological order, and that is because even though there is history in the Torah, but its primary purpose is not history. Primary purpose is lesson. Okay, there's a lot to talk about. I'm going to skip a few portions and we'll go to the question I mentioned earlier, which is, why is it that we find the last third of the Parsha, we read about the daily offerings? Why are we reading about the offerings in the fourth book of the Torah, instead of the third book, which is the book of Leviticus, which is the book that describes an overwhelming majority of the laws of all the offerings? So that is a question, and we'll try to address that, and then look at some of the details of that portion, and then we'll see what happens. So this is the fifth reading of the portion, Numbers chapter 28. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Command the children of Israel and say to them, my offering, my food for my fire offerings, a spirit of satisfaction for me, you shall take care to offer me at its appointed time." In other words, God says, you have to offer my food. They translate it as food, but it's really my bread. It's karbani, my offering, lachmi, my bread, liishai, for my fire, reach nechachi, the spirit of my for an aroma of satisfaction, tishmeru, guard, be careful, la'akriv li b'moado, to offer at the appointed time. What is the offering? And you shall say to them, this is the fire offering which you shall offer to the Lord. 2 unblemished lambs in the first year, each day as a continual burnt offering. Every day they would offer two lambs in the temple. The one lamb you shall offer up in the morning, and the other lamb you shall offer in the afternoon. And then it talks about the other things that comes with the lamb. And eventually you read about verse 9, B'yom HaShabbat, on the Shabbat day, you have the musaf, the additional offerings. Then in verse 11, U'brashechot shechem, on the beginning of your months, it's every Rosh Chodesh you have an offering. And then it continues in the next reading about the holidays. Now, the question is, what is this doing here? It's in the wrong book. Why is it appearing in Pinchas, the end of the story? It should have been in the book of Leviticus. So there are multiple answers. One answer is that what's happening here is this based on a medrash. The medrash says that if you turn back to the end of the fourth reading, you will see that what was the story that preceded the laws of the offerings? This is the story of Moshe asking God to appoint a successor for the Jewish people. Moses spoke to the Lord saying, "Let the Lord, the God of spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation, who will go forth before them and come before them, who will lead them out and bring them in, so that the congregation of the Lord will not be like sheep without a shepherd." So Moshe is about to pass away. And basically he says to God, he says, look, you have to make sure that they have a leader. Why? So they shouldn't be like sheep without a shepherd. And God says, you know what? Okay, take Joshua. Why Joshua is another story. We're not going to get into that right now. And that's the conclusion of the story. The conclusion of the story, Moses did as the Lord has commanded him, and he took Joshua and presented him before Elazar the Kohen and before the entire congregation. He laid his hands upon him and commanded him in accordance with what the Lord has spoken to Moses. So we appoint Joshua. Immediately after the appointment of Joshua, you read about the commandment of the daily offerings. What is going on here? So let's read Rashi. Command the children of Israel. What is stated above? Let the Lord appoint. The Holy One, blessed be he, said to him, before you command me regarding my children, command my children regarding me. It is analogous to a princess who was about to depart from the world and was instructing her husband about her children. And he replied, before you instruct me about them, instruct them about me, as it is stated in Sifri. So there's a very interesting parable here. Parable is as follows. There's a woman about to die. So she tells her husband, this is how I want you to treat my children after I die. So the husband tells the wife, he says, instead of telling me how to deal with your children, tell your children how to deal with me. In other words, make sure they'll treat me okay. Okay, what is the analog? So you have here, God is the father, you have the children of Israel are the children, and Moses is the mother. Moses is about to pass away. So Moses tells God, I'm about to pass away. You got to find somebody to help take care of the children. You got to find Joshua. So what does God respond? God responds, okay, I'll take care of Joshua, but now tell your children not to forget about their old father, not to forget about me. And that's the response. That's why we talk about how are the Jewish people going to quote unquote take care of God? How are they make sure not to forget about God? That is the daily offerings. He needs bread. That's what God, the first time in the Torah, we refer to the offerings as God's bread, which is very strange. It sounds absurd. God needs bread. God needs breakfast. So he tells the Jewish people, make sure to deliver breakfast to me every day, breakfast and lunch, once in the morning, once at night. Very strange. We'll get to that in a minute. But what I'm trying to get at is, according to Rashi's Medrash, especially the way we're going to explain it in a moment, it's really in response. It's in response to Moshe's passing. It's in response to Moshe's passing. We're entering a new phase. What's the new phase? The new phase is, if you look at Moshe's words carefully, Moshe says God should appoint a leader so that the Jewish people should not feel like they are a shepherd which have like they are sheep which have no shepherd. Moshe is very concerned. Moshe was the loyal shepherd for the people. Moshe was concerned that once they cross into Israel, they sort of scatter around the land. Each person's on their own. There's no leader. They don't feel, the Jewish people may feel abandoned. The Jewish people may feel that they don't have a leader. They don't have someone they can look up to. And he says, therefore, you should appoint a leader for them, and God says Joshua. But then God says, 1 second, if you're talking about leadership, now that you raised that the Jewish people should not feel that they are like a sheep without a leader, who is the real leader? Who is the ultimate leader of the Jewish people? That's God. Okay? So now, if you're talking to me about leading the people, now the Jewish people have to do something to remember their relationship with God on a constant basis, and to remember and realize and be cognizant and be aware of the fact that they are not like sheep without a shepherd, because God is their leader and God has a relationship with them. That's the concern here. The concern is what's going to happen? Who's going to remind the people that they have a leader? So there's a technical leader, a physical leader who's going to help them go into the land of Israel. Wonderful. And relate to their true leader. But the true leader is God. And therefore, what God is saying is, if you're talking about succession, if you're talking about having the Jewish people transition to a new reality in the land of Israel, now the question becomes, who is going to remind the Jewish people that they do have a leader? Who's the leader? God's the leader. Who's going to do it? The daily offerings. How do the daily offerings do it? We'll talk about that in a minute, what the daily offerings represent. But the point here is, this is not about offerings per se. If it's about an offering per se, then it doesn't belong in the fourth book, it belongs in the third book. This is about the transition, the Jewish people entering the land of Israel, and how will they incorporate the awareness that even in Israel, even when Moshe passes, even when they're not being led by the miracles that Moshe performed, that they understand that they are not sheep without a leader, because they have a leader, they have God in their life. And the answer to that is in the portion of the offerings, which we'll have to address. So I just want to touch upon this for a minute or two, and then maybe we can move to the next subject within the portion of the offerings. So God refers, again, like I said, God for the first time refers to the offerings as bread. Et karbani, my offering. Lachmi, my bread. Leishai, my fire. Reach nichachi, the pleasing aroma for me. Guard and bring it every day. God says, I need bread, and I need your bread. Now, what does it mean God needs our bread? It's absurd. Like I said, if we don't eat, we die. If God doesn't eat, he dies. What's happening here? So the one way to understand the metaphor of bread, according to the Hasidic commentaries, is as follows. Let's think about the food. If you think about it, food is actually the perfect metaphor for the offerings. How so? So what happens if I don't eat? I don't eat, I die. What happens? So the body dies. The soul is not affected. The soul doesn't need food. The body needs food. If you don't eat, the body dies, the soul is alive. The soul lives on. In other words, what's the function of food? The function of the food is really from a mystical perspective, it's really connecting the soul and the body. It's not for the soul per se. It's to allow for the soul to connect to the body. The body needs the strength. The body needs the nutrients to be able to contain the soul. But if the body doesn't eat, then the body is too weak. The body can no longer contain the soul, and the soul will evaporate. So let's talk about God in this context. God, the Medrash says, God is like the soul of the universe. The universe is the body. The physical universe we look at is the body. And then God is the soul of the universe. So what happens if we don't eat? Okay, if we don't offer the offerings, what happens if we don't eat? If we don't eat, God is fine. But the problem here is that the relationship between the soul and the body lacks. In other words, what is the function of offerings as the food of God? The food of God means that substance that connects the soul, which is God, and us, the created being, which is the body. In other words, just like food connects soul and body, the offerings connect God and the creation. How so? They bring that awareness that we're in a relationship with God. And if we're in a relationship with God, then that connects us. And then we go into the details of why the Torah refers to it as my fire offering, because that is really what the way the offerings serve as bread. So we know there's the Kabbalistic doctrine of Ratzov Ashov, there's running and returning. And in a relationship, with our relationship with God, there's the running. We want to yearn, we want to escape, we want to connect to God. That's the metaphor. We're like fire. Fire is where the flame surges upward. It defies gravity. It goes upward, and our soul too yearns and wants to escape the physical and connect to God. That's going upward. That's the running. That's running upward. And then there's the return. Once God sees that we want a relationship with Him, so then He wants a relationship with us, and then He descends into this finite world, even though He's infinite. And that's the word reach nichochi, the pleasing aroma. I don't want to get into this right now too much, but into the words. But the word nichochi is related to the Aramaic word for descent, chut, descending, nachit, descended. So when we have a fire, when we desire to go up and connect to God, then God wants to come down. God doesn't want to come if we don't want Him. But if we want Him, then He wants to come down. And that's really what this verse is saying. What this verse is saying, how do you make bread for God? Does God need breakfast? Well, it depends. If you don't need breakfast, your soul per se, your soul doesn't need the breakfast. But if the soul wants to connect to the body, then you need bread. Does God need bread? God doesn't need bread. God doesn't need anything. But for us to have a relationship with Him, in other words, for Him to be within our awareness, that is in our hands. We have to create that offering. And what is the offering? Fire. We have to have the yearning to try to connect to Him. And then what that does, it elicits within God the desire to descend. Now, today, of course, we don't have offerings, but we have the prayers that are in place of offerings. And that's why there's two prayers. There's the morning prayer and the afternoon prayer. Then there's the evening prayer, which was added later. That's another story. But in any case, what we're saying here is today, what they used to accomplish through the offerings, we accomplish through prayer. Every morning, whatever prayer you're saying Modani, you're saying Shema, doesn't matter which prayer you're saying. But the morning prayer is about creating the fire, the burnt or the fire offering, creating the desire to go upward and connect to God. And when you do so, then God wants to come down into your life and into your world and give you blessing and be present in your life. And that is the bread, which only we can offer, because bread, like I said, it's not, God doesn't need it per se, but it's the relationship between body and soul. And that's what God wants. And that's what God needs. Now, that's one point. Another quick point about the offerings, and then if we have time, we'll go to the offering of Rosh Chodesh, which is absolutely fascinating. I don't know if we'll have time to squeeze it in, but we'll try. Another point here is there's a verse that says...
Can I ask you a quick question?
Please. Yes, please. Go ahead.
I don't know if you can hear me. Hey? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So as you're speaking about this Parsha, it's making me think of when the Rebbe passed away and there was nobody appointed to take his place. So like when that happened, did they refer to this Parsha and to get some kind of guidance or inspiration?
That's a very good question. Because that is a very good question. That is a very, very good question. Okay, so That is a very good question. What I would say,
He created the, I was going to say, he created the system
right?
by which he sent the shluchim out to continue his legacy and all his people. Were people able to understand that at the time, or they really just were yearning for a leader?
So that's the thing. That's the challenge here. I'm just trying to think about how to answer this, because I don't fully know the answer to your question. In other words, what people felt. I'm sure different people had different reactions, but I think that there's an element that people did feel orphaned, and that's what God says. That's what the Torah says. That the description that the people should not be like a sheep without a leader. That description is a very powerful description, and I think certainly some people felt orphaned in that sense. But I think what you're trying to get at, and I agree with you, is that what is the response to the sense that you don't have a leader? So it's not just one response. It's not just about appointing a Joshua. They appointed Joshua, fine. So Joshua is to be the one to lead us in battle, wonderful. But that's not all. You need to think about the spiritual leadership. And the spiritual leadership is expressed with the offerings. And I think if you want to apply that to the relationship of the Hasidim to the Rebbe, but really to anybody who passes away, and every time he passes away, in some sense, the position of leadership is passed on to the next generation. So what you're really thinking about is, we have two questions. Who's going to do the physical acts of leadership, right? If you used to go to grandma for Passover, now grandma passed away, so who's going to be the one to host the Passover Seder? Okay, so that's one form of leadership. But then that's not enough. You also have to think about the spiritual leadership. In other words, a spiritual connection. How do we maintain the spiritual bond? And in the Torah, the spiritual bond is the metaphor is the offerings. And the offerings it creates that awareness that there's a spiritual connection between the people and God. But you can apply it to other relationships as well. In other words, whenever there is a lack of leadership, a passing, so there's a void, you have to think about, how do I feel the physical aspects of the void, but also how do I feel the emotional and psychological and spiritual connection to the person who passes away? And like you said, the answer to your question was, who's going to actually lead the movement? Well, that you said, that wasn't, the technicalities have been laid out by the Rebbe. That wasn't the problem. The challenge is, how do we remain spiritually connected? And that we have the Rebbe's teachings and the Rebbe's legacy, and that's the spiritual connection. But it's obviously harder to maintain a spiritual connection than it is to maintain a physical connection. So I think that what you're raising here is indeed addressing the full picture. When you think about succession, when you think about maintaining the feeling of the past, there's the physical dimension of it, which is, can we appoint Joshua? Can we appoint a successor? Can we appoint someone who's going to sign the check? And then there's can we capture the spirits? Can we remain connected on a soul level? And that's a little bit more complicated. And that requires the offerings, but the offerings, what they represent is the emotional connection. And that's why we have the fire. Fire is the emotional connection. Fire is the desire to connect. According to the Kabbalah, the spiritual connection can only happen through love. You cannot be connected to anyone spiritually if you don't have love. And love is the desire to connect. And according to the Kabbalah, when you want to connect to somebody spiritually, that elicits that they are connected to you. So in other words, in any relationship, I want to connect to my grandmother. There has to be a feeling of love for that spiritual connection to survive. Okay, we're not going to have time to talk about Rosh Chodesh, but I do want to say one more thing. And you probably heard this before, but it's a very beautiful idea. The idea is, the question, of course, is, what is the most important phrase of the Torah, right? We said the Torah's lessons. What's the most important lesson of the Torah? So you have different opinions. The Medrash says there are different opinions. What's the most important message of the Torah? One of the famous opinions you heard is Rabbi Akiva says. Rabbi Akiva says, love your fellow as yourself. This is a very important principle of the Torah. Zek klal gadol b'Torah. This is a great general principle of the Torah. Love your fellow as yourself, that's the principle. And that makes sense because loving your fellow as yourself seems to be a very general idea and encompasses many details within the Torah. Like we know the story of Hillel. If you want to capture all of Torah on one foot, say don't do to others what you don't want done to yourself. In other words, love your fellow as yourself. We understand how that's a great principle of the Torah. But then there are other opinions. And one opinion that's related to this parsha is that there was a sage of Shimon ben Pazi, a sage who says, you know what the most important principle of the Torah is? You ready? Here it is, verse 4. The one lamb you shall offer up in the morning, and the other lamb you shall offer up in the afternoon. That is the most important principle of the Torah, according to one opinion. Now the question is, what is this opinion saying? There's 613 commandments. Why is the commandment to offer one offering in the morning and one offering in the afternoon? Why is that the most important principle of the Torah? And one opinion and one interpretation is that it's not really about the offerings. It's not really about the sheep. What the Torah is really telling you is if you want to implement, if you want the ideas of the Torah to transform you, you have to be consistent. You have to do it every day, once in the morning and once at night. It's not enough once a year in the summer when you have a few minutes off, you go to a retreat and you say, I'm going to go to a spiritual retreat. And at this point, I'm going to become a good person. It doesn't work that way. If you want to transform, if you want to create kindness, if you want to create sensitivity, whatever you want to become, the only way to do it is through consistency, a small act, but every day, once in the morning and once in the afternoon. And that incorporating the act, the consistent act, is what is going to change you, is the lesson, right? We said what's important. Torah means lesson. Lesson means how could it change me? What have I learned from Torah? Not how much knowledge did I amass, but how has that knowledge affected me? And that's the opinion that says the most important part of the Torah is not what you learn, and it's not even any idea of love your fellow as yourself. The most important point is, could you do an act every morning and every night that would make that part of your habit, part of your daily schedule? And that's why Judaism is into the small acts, seemingly small acts, but if they're consistent and they're done every day, that is the way we transform. We don't transform by having once in a while inspirational experiences. The way we transform is if we could incorporate those experiences into our life on a daily basis. If every day I smile to my child, if every day I'm kind, if every day I do something to create an awareness of God, if I do this consistently, once in the morning, once in the afternoon, that is how transformation occurs. That is how we change. That is how we implement the teachings of Torah into our life. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short. Thank you for joining.
What did you say that was? Who brought that down?
Everybody is saying it, so I don't know who's the origin of this. I don't know who the origin is, but it's something all the rabbis like to talk about it because it's an interesting teaching. I don't know who the origin is. The Medrash says that the idea that what is the most important principle of the Torah is a Medrash, and you have the Tanoim, the sages of the Mishnah debate. You have Rabbi Akiva, you have Shimon ben Pazi, you have Ben Azai. We discussed that on Sunday, where he said a few Sundays ago, where he says this is the book of the Chronicles of Man. Zeh Sefer Toldot Adam is the most important principle of the Torah. But it's a very famous medrash, and it's very strange. So because it's so strange, everybody thinks about it. Who is the original person who articulated what I just said? This I don't know.
Thank you.
Okay, have a wonderful day, everybody, and enjoy the day. And don't forget, once in the morning and once in the afternoon.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Once in the morning.
Thank you so much.
Be well. Thank
Have
you.
a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Be well.